We're back, baby.
X-Men 97 brought back the nostalgia-oozing intense joyride back with a banger Season 2, and I am here for it. While the first 3 episodes have mostly been about stopping the rise of Apocalypse, there is actually a much darker tale cooking in the background. The comic readers know exactly what I'm talking about. As you know, the X-Men are now scattered across time, after the first season ended with half of them stuck in ancient Egypt, and the other half in a dystopian 40th century. Given the story picks up after some time passes, we see how a lot has been happening across all 3 timelines. But one factor that really caught my eye was Wolverine and his missing adamantium claws. Sure, we do see bone claws coming out of his hands in the first episode of Season 1, but they did break pretty easily when he tried to slice up one of Apocalypse's killer robots from the future. Even if they did end up growing back almost immediately after, these brittle bone claws are not nearly as cool or tough as Wolverine's signature adamantium claws. While he will get them back eventually, it will come at a great cost. So without wasting another moment, let's discuss the dark lore of how Logan would get his adamantium claws back in the upcoming episodes of X-Men 97 Season 2. How did Wolverine manage to lose his adamantium claws in X-Men 97 Season 1? So in the 3-episode finale from Season 1, we saw Magneto pretty much raise hell on Earth by inducing a worldwide blackout to stop an entire army of Sentinels. Given that he no longer cared for peace and had declared an all-out war against mutantators, Magneto's unhinged actions actually started causing catastrophic death and blatant destruction. The way Logan saw it, Magneto had declared an all-out war on humanity, so now it was only the X-Men who could stop him. In fact, they nearly succeeded in the process, as Wolverine ended up stabbing Magneto during the big shutdown. However, he lashed out pretty badly at Wolverine and used his magnetism powers to literally rip out the adamantium from Logan's bones, which almost killed the guy in the process. Like a lot of story arcs from X-Men 97, this story arc, where Magneto ends up removing the adamantium from Wolverine's bones, is straight up adapted from the comic books. When Andy Kubert's X-Men Volume 2 issue number 25 first came out in 1993, we saw Magneto's attempt to wipe out humanity in a similar manner, but the panel where Wolverine stabs him and the Magneto retaliates by tearing the adamantium from his bones was considered as one of the most grotesque moments in the history of Marvel Comics up to that point. The whole Fatal Attraction storyline was written by Fabian Nicieza and Scott Lobdell, and marked the X-Men's 30th anniversary with one of the most unforgettable moments in comic book history. The change stuck for a long time as Wolverine spent the next 6 years in the comics without his adamantium. At first, losing it made him noticeably less durable, since he no longer had an indestructible skeleton protecting him. But it also came with an unexpected upside, because without all that metal inside him, Magneto could no longer use his powers against Wolverine in the same devastating way, thus making Logan far more dangerous whenever they fought. Normally, Magneto has a huge advantage over him, which is why Wolverine rarely gets close enough to land a meaningful hit. In fact, his attack on Magneto during X-Men 97 Season 1 was really an exception, since Magneto was distracted at the time. It also turns out that the adamantium had been holding Wolverine back in ways he never really realized, because without the metal bonded to his skeleton, his healing factor became stronger, his senses grew even sharper, and he started relying more on his raw animal instincts. That made him much more feral during this period in the comics, which is something X-Men 97 already seems to be hinting towards, especially by leaning into his new costume and the rougher demeanor. Given how awful Logan's condition was by the end of the previous season, we all thought he would not make it, but what is an X-Men show without Wolverine? The first episode of Season 2 quickly cleared up his fate, as it turns out Wolverine along with Cyclops, Jean Grey, Storm, and Morph were sent far into the future in 3960 AD, where they joined the rebels led by Mother Ascani to fight against Apocalypse, who was ruling this barren dystopian future. Now, of course, we knew Wolverine was not as depowered as Magneto had intended, but we do get a fleeting glimpse of what this dynamic change means for him. In fact, even the intro sequence of the first episode is specifically tweaked in order to give bone claws to Wolverine in his title card. However, these bone claws did put our guy at a disadvantage against the robot goons sent by Apocalypse. I mean, his adamantium claws could cut through literally anything and everything, but brittle bones will shatter when you try to use it to slice through a robot's head. Luckily for Wolverine, they at least grow back quickly. But as we see it, when Wolverine broke his bone claws, his eyes went wide and he screamed like he just stubbed his toe. So he just ripped off the robot's head out of anger. Now, X-Men 97 giving Wolverine bone claws means the show is undergoing the same retcon as the comics. Up until Fatal Attractions, when Wolverine lost his adamantium, his claws were understood to be artificial implants, and that is definitely how X-Men the Animated Series also portrayed them, because the show's Season 2's Repo Man flashes back to the Weapon X experiment where Wolverine was bonded to the adamantium, and when the claws first pop out of his knuckles, he was horrified. Later, we see how Mr. Sinister disabled the X-Men's mutant powers, but that did not affect Wolverine, as he could still use his claws because according to him, there was nothing mutant about these. Of course, without his healing factor, it was incredibly painful to unsheathe them. Then in Season 5's Old Soldiers, we saw Logan team up with Captain America during World War II. At this point, Wolverine explicitly did not have his claws, but he did wear some climbing gloves that have metal blades attached, which as he said were not half bad. But having said that, I think retcons are not always a bad thing. After all, Magneto's now iconic backstory as a Holocaust survivor was not introduced until 1981, which was nearly 20 years after the character first appeared. But the idea that Wolverine was born with bone claws has always been more divisive. For many fans, it takes away some of the tragedy behind Wolverine's origin. The original Weapon X story painted Logan as someone whose humanity was stolen from him. The program then turned him into a living weapon by grafting adamantium onto his skeleton and giving him claws designed for one purpose, which is killing. That history makes his lifelong struggle to overcome his violent instincts far more powerful. So, if the claws were always part of him, some of that horror and symbolism is inevitably lost. That debate may not matter for much longer though, as Wolverine will eventually get his adamantium back. Now, how long X-Men 97 will keep Wolverine's bone claws is still anyone's guess, but it would be great if they lasted through most of Season 2. Giving the change some time to breathe would let the series explore how it reshapes Wolverine, while also showing how his enemies might try to exploit the fact that he is more vulnerable than he has been in years. How did Wolverine regain his adamantium claws back in the comics? Given that you already know how Magneto pulled out Wolverine's adamantium, which led him to discover that his claws are naturally made of bone, I do not think we need a detour to the Fatal Attraction storyline. So, I am going to jump right into the 99th issue of Wolverine Volume 2, which is the starting point of what sets off to be one of Logan's darkest story arcs. At this point in Marvel history, Wolverine was already undergoing an agonizing physical and mental regression. Without the stabilizing presence of the artificial adamantium implants, which Magneto had ripped out in X-Men issue 25, Logan was slowly losing his humanity and turning into a wild, feral beast. Meanwhile, the mysterious organization called Landau, Luckman, and Lake sends agent Zoe Culloden to guide Wolverine to Aqaba, Egypt, which was the ancient birthplace of Apocalypse. Once he reaches Egypt, Wolverine discovers the citadel of the Dark Riders, who were servants of Apocalypse. But instead of following the path provided for him, Logan sneaks in through a side entrance to investigate, where he is quickly ambushed and overpowered by a mutant shapeshifter called Dirtnap and a young villain named Genesis, who is secretly trying to resurrect Apocalypse. Inside the citadel, Wolverine first comes across Dirtnap still in his rat form. As he chases after his recent sparring partner, he goes right into the barrel of a blaster held by Genesis. That is how Genesis knocks out Logan with a single blast, and has his Dark Riders drag him into the lab where Wolverine is placed into a biotube. That is how we find out that their malicious master plan involves Genesis trying to use the adamantium ripped from Cyber's body and bond it to Wolverine's skeleton once again in order to make him the perfect weapon once again. Not just that, they also intend to brainwash Logan and turn him into Death, as a new version of one of the Horsemen of the Apocalypse. So in the 100th issue of Wolverine, we see Genesis forcefully bond a brand new adamantium skeleton to Wolverine's body. At the same time, Cannonball and Zully Culloden also travel to Madripoor to use a teleportation chamber to go after Wolverine to rescue him. Once they break into the Citadel, we also learn that Genesis has kidnapped millions of Egyptians and placed them in a special sarcophagi that would channel their life forces into one that supposedly has the body of Apocalypse within, so their master could hopefully be resurrected. Soon Genesis ordered the Dark Riders to begin the adamantium bonding and the mind-wiping process in hopes of succeeding in his mega plan. But Wolverine's healing factor begins to resist the bonding, which causes Logan to suffer an excruciating amount of pain. However, Genesis only keeps pressing harder, and just as the bonding process starts to succeed, Cannonball comes out of hiding to attack Genesis and the other Dark Riders after smashing some of the equipment. Although Sam catches them off guard, the Dark Riders soon knock the boy down and pile onto him, beating him savagely. However, the system is so severely damaged that Logan begins to resist as Life Force attempts to get things under control. Unfortunately, it was too late, as the holding tanks exploded, thus showering the lab with adamantium shrapnel, which killed both Hurricane and Life Force. Luckily, he was alive, and when Genesis tried to kidnap him again, Cannonball gets up and blasts the two away after telling Logan that they have to stop Apocalypse from coming back from the dead. After blasting into the next room, Cannonball blacks out from his beating and crashes among the many sarcophagi. When he wakes up later, Logan is nowhere to be found. But then Cannonball gets attacked by a Dark Rider, prompting Wolverine to attack from the shadows and kills the guy. Then, one by one, Wolverine began killing all the other Dark Riders, including Deadbolt and Gauntlet, which convinced Dirtnap to flee the scene. While that was happening, Genesis took Sam hostage and dragged the boy to the creche of Apocalypse, as he intended to move it to a safer location. However, once they arrived, Logan made himself seen, which led Sam, aka Cannonball, to point out that Genesis may not live to see Apocalypse's dream of survival of the fittest come true. This was because Genesis' experiments had somehow pushed Wolverine's evolution ahead to a more feral state, and that is why he attacked Genesis savagely like an animal. While Logan was hacking Genesis to death, Cannonball ran to the creche and opened it, only to find it surprisingly empty, which naturally made him wonder if Apocalypse was even in there to begin with. When he turned around to tell this to Logan, all Sam saw was the lifeless corpse of Genesis. Wolverine then emerged from the darkness to tell Sam to apologize to Cable on his behalf, as he has no choice but to kill his son. Later, when Logan chose not to go back to the mansion, Cannonball realized that they had lost Logan in more ways than one. At the end of the issue, we see Elektra voluntarily take up the mission to locate Logan and train him how to find the path again. Now, the story continues to Uncanny X-Men issue 332, and then comes back to Wolverine issue 101, as Logan's regression into his animal form only gets worse due to what Genesis tried to do to him. We see him go full-on feral, misplace his nose, and even lick Cyclops at one point. But as improper as it was, none of it happens all at once, of course. I know you are wondering why Wolverine turned feral when he lost his adamantium. In a story not unlike Logan's acknowledgement that the adamantium was killing Wolverine, the comics established that the metal was suppressing his mutation, as if he was always fated to be savage. Luckily in the comics, Wolverine won his battle with savagery without the return of his claws, but he still sought them out. He constantly had the capacity to fall into savagery, and control is as important to Wolverine as it is to the Hulk. Having said that, all of this boils down to the creation of one of the coolest versions of Wolverine in the X-Men lore. Yes, I am indeed talking about Death. So in the 145th issue of Wolverine, which back then was billed as the special 25th anniversary edition for Wolverine, saw Wolverine facing Apocalypse. That is when he was given what amounted to an audition to become one of the villain's horsemen, in return for the restoration of his adamantium. Typically, this was not exactly a fair negotiation, because the alternative was Sabretooth becoming the horseman known as Death, and potentially posing an even greater threat. So Wolverine opted in and fought his old enemy for the right to become Death. But there are multiple storylines entwined within, especially when the X-Men realized that the man they thought was Wolverine was nothing more than a Skrull imposter. The real Wolverine was actually abducted by the Skrulls and taken to Apocalypse, who pitted Sabretooth and Wolverine against each other for the right to become the new Horseman Death. Even though Wolverine was facing a larger, stronger opponent with his bone claws, he was determined that Sabretooth would be a merciless killer, and so he needed to find a way to beat the programming out of him. But after winning, Apocalypse infuses Wolverine with the adamantium taken from Sabretooth, and well, that is how he gets his adamantium claws back. The previous years without his adamantium were horrifying for Wolverine, and this vulnerability was an opportunity for Apocalypse to turn one of the world's greatest warriors into his ultimate weapon. After Logan defeated Sabretooth, Apocalypse suggested him to intense physical and psychological conditioning. By using his advanced celestial technology, he fully rebuilt Wolverine's body, restored his adamantium skeleton, and enhanced it even further. More importantly, he brainwashed Logan by stripping away his free will and transforming him into his new Horseman of Death. As Death, Wolverine became stronger, faster, and far more ruthless than ever before. Apart from his healing factor and physical abilities being amplified, Apocalypse equipped him with new deadly powers, including the ability to generate powerful energy blasts through his claws. As Death, Wolverine was completely loyal to Apocalypse and carried out all his missions without hesitation, thus becoming one of the villain's most dangerous enforcers. He also played a major role in the Age of Apocalypse story, but eventually through the pages, Wolverine's true personality began to break through the brainwashing. And with help from his friends and his own indomitable will, Logan fought off Apocalypse's control in order to reclaim his identity. Although he was freed, the experience left lasting psychological scars in his already traumatic life. Will X-Men 97 use this particular storyline? As of now, Apocalypse restoring Wolverine's adamantium is truly the strongest comic-based possibility of where the story could go. But I should say that it is not guaranteed to happen exactly the same way. In case you forgot, Season 1 ended by introducing Ensaba Nur, the future Apocalypse, and from what it looks like, Season 2 is already building toward Apocalypse and his 4 horsemen. Wolverine has always been something of an outsider, even among the X-Men. If his increasingly feral instincts continue to take that over, that could leave him vulnerable to someone like Apocalypse, who has a long history of exploiting powerful heroes at their lowest points. It's easy to imagine Logan being recruited as one of Apocalypse's horsemen, possibly even War, considering his long military history and reputation as one of Marvel's deadliest fighters. It would also fit Wolverine's personality. As you know, he is rarely reckless for the sake of it, but he is the X-Man who is willing to make the impossible call if he believes it is absolutely necessary. That is exactly why he abandoned the X-Men's attempts to reason with Magneto and chose to attack him instead. Logan has always carried the weight of his past, and if Apocalypse offered him a way to control or even embrace his increasingly savage nature, it would create quite a compelling internal conflict. It would also force Wolverine to confront the fear that the beast inside him might one day win, thus making his struggle as a potential horseman as much an emotional battle as a physical one. Having said that, you should know that Marvel has also launched X-Men 97 Season 2, which is a 5-issue prequel series that bridges the gap between Seasons 1 and 2 of X-Men 97. So far, though, the comic has not given us much in terms of Wolverine regaining his adamantium, but the trailer for X-Men 97 Season 2 does have a shot of Logo with his adamantium claw. But so far, Wolverine issue number 145 remains the clearest blueprint for how the show could handle the transformation, rather than serving as confirmation of what will actually happen in the series. How do you guys think the animated series will handle Wolverine regaining his adamantium back? Let us know about your thoughts and theories in the comment box below.